I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, we had Ukraine elections on Sunday. We have Vladimir Zelensky as the new president of Ukraine. People are well aware of who he is by this point. By the time this video goes on air, I'm sure people will have heard about what happened in Ukraine. Of course, you have Petro Poroshenko, who was the president after the Maidan coup. He's gone. He's on his way out. Zelensky is a comedian, an actor comedian. He works for an oligarch named Igor Kolomoiskiy, who I'm sure we'll get into on his channel. And there's a lot of debate as to his role in all of this. But we have big change in Ukraine, or at least what appears to be big change. The verdict is still out, and I think we'll see over time exactly who this Zelensky guy really is. But what do you make of the elections? First impression.
Right, my own personal view is that this is a big change, and I'm going to explain why. Now, I should say, first of all, that Zelensky himself, I consider a very almost inconsequential figure. As you correctly say, he seems to be a proxy for this very powerful and very corrupt and rather sinister oligarch, Igor Kolomoiskiy, who is the sort of baron of the eastern city of Dnipropetrovsk, and who's had a particular animus against Poroshenko. And I don't personally take Zelensky himself very seriously. But what I think should be taken seriously is the results of the elections. Because, of course, Poroshenko is the president who embodied more than anyone else what one might call the Maidan revolution. I put the word revolution in inverted commas because, as far as I'm concerned, it was never really a revolution. It was a coup in which the constitutional and democratically elected president of Ukraine, who was Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown violently. But nonetheless, I've never disputed that there was, with all of the interference by outside powers in Ukraine, nonetheless, a strong popular movement that did express itself on Maidan Square in 2013 and 2014, and which did embody a genuine powerful force within Ukrainian society. Now, I think what this election shows is that that force has not only peaked in its strength some time ago, but that it is now in very severe decline. And I think the evidence for that is the election result. I mean, this is an election in which there was a 62% turnout, which is quite high for this part of the world, in which 4 million Ukrainians in Russia who would have probably voted for Zelensky and against Poroshenko, but who were prevented from voting because of the laws that Poroshenko passed. They didn't vote, and in which Poroshenko would have had the support of the very large number of people who are employed by the government, in effect the payroll vote, and in which he had the support of the very strongly nationalist western province around Lvov, the old Habsburg province of Galicia, which is the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism and of the Maidan movement. But the point is that despite having those advantages, Poroshenko lost big, I mean very big. Around 3/4 of Ukrainians who voted against him. Only a quarter of the vote, as I said, much of it made up of the so-called payroll, what I would call the payroll vote, and of the people involved. Only a quarter of those people actually voted for Poroshenko. So it is impossible for me to see this as anything other than a massive repudiation by Ukraine's population and Ukraine's society of what has been happening to Ukraine over the last 5 years. And the fact that they are prepared to vote for anybody, in effect, apart from Poroshenko, the fact that they literally voted for a clown, says, to my mind, what they think about what the Ukrainian political class that came to power in 2014 as a result of the Maidan coup has done to their country. And I think any Ukrainian political leader, including Zelensky, including Kolomoiskiy, has to now take that into account. And I think that what we will probably see gradually over the coming months and years is, with the ebbing away of this ultranationalist Maidan movement, an attempt slowly to repair the damage, to start restoring the links with Russia, to try to find a way to rebalance Ukraine away from this ultranationalist policy that it has followed, and towards some kind of rapprochement, both with Russia and with the people of eastern Ukraine in the Donbass, who have made it absolutely clear that they will have no part of any Ukraine that is part of this extraordinary and dangerous ultranationalist current. So I am mildly optimistic about this. I want to stress this is not optimism about Zelensky as an individual. It is certainly not optimism about Igor Kolomoiskiy, who should be in prison. It is a optimism born of the election results, which I think are more important than either Zelensky or Kolomoiskiy themselves are.
Yeah, but my question to you, Alexander, is this is all well and done. This isn't fine to say that they'll find a way to mend ties with Russia and to honor the electorate and the way they've spoken. You know, all these guys from Kolomoiskiy to Zelensky. But my question to you is, will the far right ultranationalists in the West allow this to happen? I mean, they're not going to, allow Ukraine to mend ties even slightly with Russia without putting up a violent, and I think this is the key point, a violent fight and a violent struggle.
I think this is an important point. I want to make this absolutely clear. I mean, I don't expect Zelensky or Kolomoiskiy themselves to really commit themselves to an improvement with relations with Russia. I have no real expectations of them doing so. But I think there will now be a drag factor from Ukrainian society. And I expect, if nothing else, that Zelensky and Kolomoiskiy will now try to dial the anti-Russian rhetoric down. You're absolutely right. If there is any attempt in Ukraine to mend relations with Russia, even in a small way, we're going to see an extremely violent reaction from the ultra-right, the ultra-nationalist right, and from the people around who live around Lvov, from Galicia, in fact. And they already have formed. I mean, they've overthrown 3 Ukrainian governments before, in 2004, in 2007, and in 2014. What has changed, and it has not existed before, is that until very recently, Ukraine was a deeply polarized country. It was almost 50-50. There was 50% of the population which was inclined towards the nationalists, the ultra-nationalists, and inclined towards an anti-Russian position. And that you had 50% who rejected the nationalist position and wanted to mend fences to some extent with Russia. Now, what has happened in this election is that despite the loss of Crimea, which of course always wanted closer relations with Russia, despite the loss of the Donbass, which of course also always wanted relations with Russia, despite the fact that 4 million Ukrainians in Russia were prevented from voting, 75% of Ukrainians rejected emphatically this ultranationalist platform. In other words, there has been a very big popular shift away from it. And that means that these very violent ultra-rightist people in Ukraine no longer have that base of popular support that previously gave them confidence and which they worked with. So, of course, they are still there. Of course, they will work to the extent that they can against any rapprochement. And of course, Zelensky himself and Kolomoiskiy are no longer to be relied upon. But as a stage in Ukraine's evolution, which this election is, this is an important stage because it is the first big step towards a final defeat of these extremist people who up to now have been able to claim that much of Ukrainian society supported them, but will no longer be able to do so. And that is an important shift which should not be underestimated.
These extremists, though, are heavily supported by NATO, by the United States, and by the EU. I mean, many of our viewers will probably be watching this video kind of saying, what? You know, the United States, the EU, and NATO are supporting far right. And when I mean far right, I could say the word, but if I say the word, we're going to definitely get demonetized. I mean, we're talking as right as you can go. These are the people that are supported and funded and propped up and pushed to create division in Ukraine by the United States, NATO, and the European Union. Is that correct or not?
Absolutely. I mean, can I also make an observation here? I mean, every time I switch on MSNBC, CNN, every time I read the Washington Post and the New York Times, every time I open the Guardian, I read endless articles of all sorts of Clintonites and Democrats and people like that talking endlessly about the great threat of the far right and the threat it poses to democracy. The one place in Europe where there really is a far right in control and pushing the levers of power and showing an extraordinary propensity for violence, these same people who denounce the far right in every other situation, who talk about Donald Trump being part of the far right, and who talk about anybody they don't like being part of the far right. The one place where it exists, which is in Ukraine, they support it. So I mean, that's the reality. And when you say as far right as it is possible to get, you are being factually accurate. I mean, if you listen to some of these people, if you see the sort of slogans they have, if you see the kind of banners they march under, I mean, you can be under no illusions at all about the sort of people they are. So, yes, they will continue to get that kind of support. But this is the important point. People are now prepared to vote against them in enormous numbers like we've never seen before. There is a popular resistance to them in eastern Ukraine. I mean, the popular resistance we saw in the Donbass is because the people of the Donbass are not prepared to accept the far right, these ultra far right people. If you continue to try to impose them and their ideology, now that the majority of people and the big majority of people in Ukraine are rejecting it, all that is going to do eventually is provoke a reaction. So what is going to happen is that the opinions that already exist in the Donbass, the resistance, if you like, that is already there in the Donbass, is simply going to spread. So that's the danger of the policy that the Western powers are following if they continue to follow it. Now, I'm going to say something else about this, which is that, of course, some countries in Europe are starting to understand this. The key country is Germany. I think the Germans are very tired of Ukraine. I think that they made major economic sacrifices back in 2014 to support this project when they agreed very reluctantly to the sanctions on Russia that the US and the UK insisted upon. German investment in Russia is now at record levels, which is in a way the German business community casting its own vote about what they think with this strategy. Mercedes-Benz has now opened a gigantic factory in Russia. I think they're absolutely fed up with Ukraine and with this whole story. And I think they're going to be extremely reluctant from now on to continue to write the checks for this policy of supporting the far right in Ukraine, especially as they sense that he's going to start provoking more and more resistance. So I think this policy is now going to start encountering more resistance, both within Ukraine itself and within Germany. And I think this election possibly marks the turning point, the point where we could say peak Maidan is past.
Can we say that the people in Ukraine are finally beginning to wake up to the fact that they were completely duped? I mean, going back to Germany, for example, you said Germany, okay, supported, Obama's regime change and Obama's coup. And it was Obama's coup.
Absolutely.
Obama and Biden.
Absolutely.
It was their regime change in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
No doubt about it. Obama spearheaded this. And he has blood on his hands, a good, 15, 20,000 people from the war in the East.
More, I believe.
Right.
Many more, I believe.
Okay, yeah. So can we say that now Germany with Nord Stream 2 is sticking it to Ukraine economically, saying, you know what, we're done with you guys. We're going to build our own pipeline. We don't need you anymore. Are the people in Ukraine, do you think they realize that? Do you think the people in Ukraine realize that Europe, no matter what they say, they're not going to get into the EU, number one? And the EU may not even be, with Brexit going on, may not even be that much of an attraction to begin with. In other words, after Maidan, I think people in Ukraine thought, we're going to get into Europe and we're all going to be driving BMWs and making, 5,000 euros a month. I mean, do you think people are waking up to this fact that what they were sold in 2014 was one big lie?
I think absolutely. I think there are many things to point out about this. I think for a lot of people who supported Ukraine's integration with the EU, I think a lot of it was about getting away from Russia. I think a lot of younger people had bought into the anti-Russian narrative in Ukraine. And I think that they thought that the EU and the West was the place to go and that this was all going to work out better for Ukraine. This is exactly the same narrative that many people in Russia once upon a time accepted. And of course, the Russians gradually came to the realization that that wasn't, for Russia, a true narrative at all. And I think Ukrainians, with a gap of perhaps 10 to 15 years, are coming to that conclusion also. The simple fact is, Ukraine was promised lots of things back in 2013, 2014 with the EU association agreement. Not only have those promises not been delivered, but for most Ukrainians, the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, life has just got on getting much worse. The economy is not doing well. In spite of what people say, it's contracting. Living standards are falling. Education standards are falling. Utility prices are rising. And things are just going from bad to worse. There's been the war, there's been the loss of Crimea, there's been the loss of the Donbass. Many thousands of people are dead. This has been a disaster. The West has simply not done the things it promised to do. The golden age that was promised has not come. And I think people are now coming away and looking at things and are saying to themselves, clearly this isn't working. Clearly these people are not to be believed. Look at who's running the show here. These very violent and very corrupt men with guns. And maybe the time has come for us to start looking for a different way, a way that is more focused on Ukraine itself and on its own needs. And that might involve coming to terms with Russia, which is this great country next door with which we have all these contacts. One of the most interesting things about Zelensky is that not only does he come from a Russian-speaking city in Ukraine's east, Kryvyi Rog, but he has also been very open about speaking in Russian during the election campaign. So that was already a pretty dramatic thing for him to do, a dangerous thing for him to do in some respects, but an important thing for him to do. And I think that in itself tells its own story. So I think I come back to what I'm saying. I think peak Maidan has passed. Peak EU sentiment has also passed. Peak pro-Western sentiment has also passed. I think the direction is now moving the direction of politics has now changed.
Yeah, I mean, in 2014, I was making the joke that, God, people in Ukraine are wrecking their country to get into the EU. And, we're in Greece and in Cyprus, and we're like begging to get out of the EU. We're like, geez, what are you guys thinking? Ask us. We'll tell you, don't buy into any of these lies that they're telling you.
Well, there you go. I mean, Ukraine has paid a terrible price for this.
A terrible price.
A terrible price. I mean, we in Greece and people in Cyprus, you in Cyprus, you've paid a big, big price. Ukraine has paid a much bigger price. I mean, it's had a terrible war. Its economic crisis is been far greater. It's now the poorest country in Europe, where, based on its resources, its level of education, the big industrial inheritance it got from the Soviet Union, it should have been a rich country. It's now, as I said, the poorest country in Europe. Apparently, there are parts of Africa which are richer.
Yeah, and I was there the year. Yeah, and I was there the year before the Maidan. It's just a beautiful country.
Absolutely.
Beautiful country, beautiful people. It's just a tragedy what happened. But Alexander, let's get into the people. You said it's not so much about Zelensky and Kolomoiskiy, but let's answer some questions that I'm sure a lot of our viewers are going to have.
Yeah.
Do you believe that Zelensky is controlled by Kolomoiskiy?
Yes. I personally, I don't have any doubts about this. And can I just say something else? I mean, everybody.
And what does that mean?
Yeah. Okay.
What does that mean as well? Yeah.
Can I just a very quick thing. I mean, he became famous through a television program in which he played the role of a school teacher who becomes president of Ukraine and clears out the oligarchs. I think that was not chance. I think that TV program, which was paid for by Kolomoiskiy, was basically to set him up as a presidential candidate. I think that was a very carefully planned scheme. Now, what Kolomoiskiy is about Kolomoiskiy. Kolomoiskiy is only interested in himself. He is a deeply corrupt man. His bank, Privat Bank, which was the center of his, the linchpin of his corruptly acquired empire, was nationalized by Poroshenko in what was basically a grab. Kolomoiskiy has been able to get a court decision to have that nationalization reversed. And I think what he now wants and what he's looking for is someone in charge of the presidency in Kiev who will return all the assets that Poroshenko seized and took away from him to Kolomoiskiy, and who will protect Kolomoiskiy from all sorts of various attacks.
That was in a London court, correct? The reversal,
absolutely, yeah. Exactly. Now, I don't personally take very seriously claims about Kolomoiskiy being some great Ukrainian nationalist. As I said, I think Kolomoiskiy is purely in this for himself. As far as he's concerned, I think he would prefer to see some sort of economic revival in Ukraine, which will make him richer. And if that means doing deals with the Russians, I don't think he's going to stand in the way of that. He is a totally corrupt man. He is, by all accounts, a pretty, tough and ruthless customer. I do not think he wants to see Russian influence expanded in Ukraine, because I think he will see that as a threat to himself. But I think if some kind of deal with the Russians can be done, I think he will go along with it. And I think he will lean on Zelensky to accept it. The big question is whether Zelensky is now that he's become president, is going to continue to want to be a puppet of Kolomoiskiy. We shall see. Lots of unanswered questions there.
So basically, Kolomoiskiy's balancing act is going to depend on doing business with Russia so I can, become richer, line my pockets with more money, but don't get too close to Russia out of fear that what Putin did to the oligarchs back when he got into power, he doesn't want to see that come to Ukraine, where he becomes a target as well of getting, thrown out like what Putin did to the Russian oligarchs. He doesn't want what happened to the Russian oligarchs to happen in Ukraine as well.
Exactly. I mean, let's be very clear about this. There are no oligarchs in Russia anymore. There are very rich businessmen, but they don't have political power. In Ukraine, oligarchs are still oligarchs. People like Kolomoiskiy, who are in theory businessmen, wield enormous political power. And the problem with Ukraine is it has had this dysfunctional system whereby these very powerful individuals like Kolomoiskiy, like Rinat Akhmetov, like lots of others, and Poroshenko himself, have manipulated the ultranationalists in Lvov, Galicia, and the rest to try to keep Ukraine itself dysfunctional and to prevent it getting closer to Russia and thus posing a threat to themselves. And I think that is the game that Kolomoiskiy is still going to try to play. We will see to what extent Zelensky is prepared to go along with it. But I think what this election shows is that the popular tide is starting to run against people like Kolomoiskiy. I think, in a sense, this election result ended up delivering a much bigger victory than Kolomoiskiy ever anticipated. And I can easily see how this could run out of his control.
And Father Alexander, would you say that probably the solution to Ukraine's problems, I mean, they've been over this. They've had regime change, revolutions, color revolutions, new leaders come, new leaders go, the oligarchs. I mean, Maidan was not an isolated event. They had one in 2004. This has been going on for a while now. Would you say that perhaps in order to remedy this, the best solution, the most logical solution is not to look east, but maybe look west and to say, you know what, Galicia, it's time for you guys to go?
I've been saying this ever since 2013, when the Maidan protests began. I came to this view extremely reluctantly. I mean, I don't like to see countries break up, and I always wanted to see Ukraine flourish and do well. But I've come gradually and very grudgingly to the view, I came to that view in 2013, and I've adhered to it ever since, that it is simply impossible to create a functioning and happy Ukraine when it has Galicia, this very angry, very anti-Russian region within it. What invariably happens is that Galicia, whenever it is confronted with a president or a government elected by the rest of Ukraine, which wants to start mending fences with Russia, without which Ukraine can't move forward, it invariably mobilizes to overthrow that president. And the result is that the president, whoever he is, goes out of his way to appease Galicia, creating within Ukraine a condition of permanent crisis in which people like the oligarchs, like people like Kolomoiskiy and Poroshenko and Akhmetov and all the others flourish. So Galicia, though it's a small place, in my opinion, is a fully viable country. I think its political culture is very distinct from the rest of Ukraine. I think in their own interests, it ought to be separated from the rest of Ukraine, form its own country, form its own state, work its way, if it likes, towards membership of NATO and the EU. I don't think the Russians would be terribly bothered about that. I don't think they want to have anything to do with Galicia. I think over time, that way, Galicia might get on top of its own ideological obsessions and start to evolve into a more, shall we say, balanced and mature, moderate and mature place, if it's not constantly frightened of being reabsorbed into the Russian colossus. And then the rest of Ukraine can finally sort itself out, rebuild the close relationship with Russia, which it needs in order to flourish, and become finally the prosperous and well-run country that it has every potential to be.
All right, Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. In the description box down below, you will find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Please donate to the Duran. That really helps us out a lot. And go to theduran.com and see all the articles that Alexander is looking up to every day. And you can follow us now on Instagram, theduran_com. And of course, if you're having trouble with notifications, download the Blank Chat app and make sure you always get notifications when we push out a new video. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you. Till next time, take care.